and it was really quite an impressive act. It went to the Wexford International Festival of Light Opera and came second, but won many other awards. Wexford, by the way, is a very big festival.
What I haven't heard from you in relation to what that gave you in those formative years was this competitiveness or this achievement focus around success or winning, which is interesting. You've not talked about that. Just how important was that?
I think you need to look inside yourself. One of the big lessons that I now do pay attention to almost on a daily basis is, think about, it's the Gandhi quote, look at yourself as the source of what's happening around you. Immersive experiences for large corporates in a very theatrical manner, getting them to really reconnect with humanity and storytelling and play in a way that they hadn't done before.
Hello and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted that Jeremy Sturt has joined me on the show today. Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, good to see you. We always start with this first question of our guests so the audience gets to know you a bit better. Tell us a bit about yourself and where your current focus is.
Okay, so Jeremy Sturt, I am one of the co-founders of Just Add Water. We are 24 years young, I should say, as a business. And we are focused around leadership advisory and culture change across the world in various sort of global entities. So we have offices here in London, Singapore, and in Brisbane and Sydney. And Brisbane and Sydney are a rather new venture for us. So, having an Australian focus has meant that officially we're a global organization, which Riley amuses me. You ask about current focus. I guess my current focus at the minute is looking forward to the weekend, as it's a Friday, and also the fact that it's the first home game of the rugby season. So delighted about that. But also in terms of the work, it really is about looking at how we can make a difference, how we can help power human performance, both within organizations, but also to actually make successful and happy and healthy lives for everyone that we work with.
Who's your rugby team?
Harlequins had a 1 point loss last week. Should have won. But there we go. We won't talk about it.
Thick and thin. So apart from the rugby, Jeremy, very normal for our guests to talk about what they do professionally, what drives them and that passion you've been doing for 24 years in this role. But tell us a bit about outside of work when you're not working, how you switch off, how you relax, how you enjoy your time.
Well, I live in the very centre of London. I've lived in London for now over, it must be 43 years. And ever since I came to drama school here, and I genuinely love London. So walking is a big hobby of mine because I live so centrally. I live 10 minutes from the river. It's great to get to the South Bank. I genuinely enjoy everything that London can bring: the parks, the open spaces, the closed spaces, the history. In particular, because of my background, theatre, and of course the sports. So London for me has an awful lot of resonance. So Claire, my wife, and I, we generally get around London as much as we can. So that's a sort of a quiet down point. I genuinely enjoy my kids now that they're in their 30s. They're an awful lot of fun to be around. So just the conversations, walking with them, going to the pub, it's generally that kind of thing. And of course, following the sports. And also, personally, I like reading. It sounds a bit daft, but reading and taking time off, and then just having good friends around. So it's generally a mix of all of that.
But I love the spaciousness that you're telling us about there outside of work. We need that space to be with family, to be with things that, again, ground us. So I love that. Thank you. Well, let's go back to your earlier years. Obviously, both of us are in our mature years now, but let's go back to the things that shaped you as a leader with hindsight in terms of those childhood experiences.
Well, where to start? I think the place I would always begin is I actually had a really happy childhood. I was I always count our family as very fortunate in that regard. I was one of three kids, actually one of four, as we would really count on it because our older sister by my dad's first marriage is very much part of who we are as siblings. And so we count Jackie in very integrally to who we are. But we grew up in Aberystwyth in Wales, caught between the sea and the mountains. Fairly idyllic, and really strong memories and powerful memories of great parents, great school times. It sort of began to change. We moved to Chelmsford in Essex because my dad got a job at the City of London Polytechnic at the time, now the City University, and so completely changed for us. But at the same time, still had the best parents who encouraged us to do everything really. So that really did shape for me quite a significant way of looking at the world, which is very optimistic. You can grab hold of anything if you want to do it. A sense of just joining in and getting involved in society. My parents were very strong Lib Democrats. My mum was mayor of Chelmsford. My father was always out doing other things. He created the National Bureau for the Handicapped Students. He brought the talking newspaper for the blind to the UK, which was quite significant in the 70s. So they were always social in that regard. They were always going out, looking after other people. I always remember a stream of people staying in the house, both disabled, able-bodied people, and everyone was welcome. Wasn't a bad childhood at all. And also, I think what shaped during those periods were two things. Sport, very definitely. Recognition that the enjoyment of sport was huge for me, of all sports, whether it was rugby, football, tennis, whatever it may be, even playing a bit of hockey, which I was rubbish at. But that was really beneficial. And also, I started going when I was a kid because Mum really encouraged us, but she encouraged in me a love of musicals. And so I always remember Gene Kelly films. I always loved tap dancing, and we used to watch those films together. My brother and sister less so, but I loved them. And so she encouraged me to join what they call the Chelmsford Young Generation Amateur Musical Society, or CYGAMS for short. And it sounds a bit odd, but there was this wonderful, very disciplined director called Ray Jeffrey, who at the time always, you thought was like ancient, but actually probably only 15, 20 years older than me, but an extraordinary character. And what he did for me and for all those kids was to provide us with a discipline and a focus around shows, which I think was probably quite rare at that age. And it was amazing. We did one show, which was Godspell, which was probably in my formative 15 to 17-year-old phase, which was such a good show that virtually everyone in that cast, about 26 strong, went into theatre in some form. And it was really quite an impressive act. It went to the Wexford International Festival of Light Opera and came second, but won many, many other awards. Wexford, by the way, is a very big festival. I see you smirking there, Mr. Andrew. But no, it was a very big festival and still is to this day. And it's Godspell. We did really well with that show. But that was probably one of the more formative things, the discipline that he sort of instilled in us as kids around dance, around theatre, around the discipline of theatre, and putting on a show for a week at a time. It was quite extraordinary at that young age, but it really did instill in me a sense of personal discipline going forward for the next, certainly until now, till nearly in my 60s. But it was fantastic in that sense. So I would say that's one of the cool things. And then the other big thing was, as I said, parents giving you the sense of openness and optimism to actually be and do whatever you want to do. And then the love of sport, the fact that you can actually create teams with all multiple different sizes of personalities and people that can actually achieve extraordinary things in a particular finite sense. So I guess they were probably the ones that have sort of carried me forward into the careers that I've had.
And on that point about the sport, it's really interesting because you're right. It's unusual for my guests in terms of having that theatrical training in their career to bring that discipline. But on the sports side, that's something that comes up quite a bit. And what I haven't heard from you in relation to what that gave you in those formative years was this competitiveness or this achievement focus around success or winning, which is interesting. You've not talked about that. Just how important was that? And is that something that's, because you've talked about team, haven't you? And
Yeah.
yeah.
It's an interesting point. I mean, winning, yes, it's always important, no question. I think it was the taking part which was more important for me. I always wanted to win. I mean, that was a sort of a natural instinct, but I think it probably was tempered because, I used to go and play rugby, and then I'd used to leave the lads and say, well, I've got to go to rehearsal. And they were like, what? It's like, yeah, I'm going to rehearsal. I'm actually going to dance with girls, whereas you are lucky if you're able to pick out any of them up. So it was that sort of mix, which was really, I think, quite helpful in the sense of, yes, we always wanted to win, but it's the taking part, and not in a sort of, everyone gets a prize from 1 all the way down to 50. It was really the sense of you're there to win. You're there, but you're also there for your team and to do the best you can. And if you don't win and the team doesn't win, then you pick yourself up and go again. So I think there was that element of it. I think was important. Every Saturday when my team doesn't win, it's really upsetting. You've got to take that on board, haven't you? So the excitement when they do that is fantastic. So winning, yes. Absolutely, but it is really what it was more the discipline and the focus that it really instilled in me.
Great, and what I'm also hearing is that pride and love for your parents, and obviously them being role models in that sense. So with all of that hodgepodge there with you, that obviously manifested in terms of those formative years, what did that mean for you in terms of your early leadership success in your 20s?
Well, it's quite interesting. So I then go back, I then move on. And so I went to Central. I studied stage management. I loved it. Loved my 2 years there. The great thing, once again, about Central, I just thought it was quite natural, was I was used to doing the Amdram, I was used to doing 8 to 10 shows a year. You get to Central and we're doing 18 shows a year because you're doing your crew in your first year, your crew for all of these shows in various forms, whether it's technical crew, sound crew, lighting, etc. And then in your second year, you're head of department for all these shows as well. So there is a real sense of both creating camaraderie in your year and also with the acting years, but also in the group of you together. And I've still got many friends of the 17 people I was in the stage management group with, who are my friends today, my closest friends, and that was really quite powerful. I think then I had always wanted to go into the West End or on Broadway. I think when we did our first round and we were asked by our tutor, what's your ambition, your aspiration? I was saying, well, I'm going to go on Broadway and call a show. And I was fortunate enough to get the breaks to do that when I was 22. So I got into the West End quite young. I went and did a show called Chess, opened the show with probably one of the finest stage managers in the world now, a lady called Sam Hunter, who taught me an awful lot. And then quickly moved into doing another show called Carrie the Musical, which was based on that book by Stephen King, the biggest flop ever on Broadway, in Broadway history up until that time in 1988. But Carrie was amazing for me personally, in the sense that I was asked by the RSC to call the show, so that's the deputy stage manager role. But to also, what was great about it was we were working in a sort of a collaborative way with British equity members and American equity members to create the show, because it opened in Stratford at the RSC and then went to the Virginia Theatre on Broadway. And this real mix was once again an opportunity to explore leadership in a different way, without personally knowing it. I'm 22, I'm doing what I'm loving. And we opened that show on a Thursday and it closed on the Saturday night. So we did four performances, not including the previews. So I think we effectively did 30 odd performances in total. But on the show was a wonderful, wonderful stage manager called Joe Lorden, who knew everybody on Broadway. And just in the short space of knowing Joe in that sort of context for about 8 months, he just taught me an awful lot just by being who he was. The value of empathy, the value of providing very clear, authoritative direction, but in a very calm, patient manner, was extraordinary, dealing with exceptional egos. And he was just excellent on it. And just role modeling that, watching that, made me realize how, when I came out of that environment and came back to do shows here in the UK, how important it was to actually take those attributes that he showed and actually utilize them in my work, in the way that I actually stood up in front of crews and various other people as well. So I'd say that was probably one of the biggest life lessons for me at that time. And then moving on to show, Sam asked me to come in and help her on the show Miss Saigon, which was probably the most technically difficult show at the time, and joined her as the technical stage manager on that. And it was the biggest show. It was at the Drury Lane. It was an awful lot wrong with it because it had been, in terms of production, it'd been really tough to get it in, to produce it and get it on stage. And there was an awful lot of technical and mechanical aspects of it that we had to sort out. So long days, tough days. Very proud of the work we did on that. But there were a number of lessons on that which were particularly pertinent to a young stage manager coming back in the West End. But yeah, I'd say that is having been surrounded by great people in theatre and realizing what it takes to actually deal with extraordinary egos in very highly pressurized environments over a short time frame. Because the beauty of theatre, as we all know, is that the opening night date is set before you even begin a rehearsal. So you know what your time frame is. And that's often quite challenging, but that's the art of the producer, isn't it?
Yes. And what I'm curious about is, during that period, some great experience, some great role models around you, as you described. What were you personally finding challenging from a leadership perspective about the way that you led yourself, or the situations you were finding challenging in terms of leadership?
Well, being honest, you're a very naive, immature young man, aren't you? So there is that aspect of it. I met my first wife on chess. We had 2 wonderful, wonderful children. And yet the pressures of the work and everything, meant that we sort of moved apart. And so in that context, you don't know at the time, but there is an awful lot of lessons there that you should be taking on board. And you think about it, and you look back at your behaviour and you go, goodness, did I really behave like that? So I think you need to look inside yourself. One of the big lessons that I now do pay attention to almost on a daily basis is, think about, it's the Gandhi quote, look at yourself as the source of what's happening around you. And it's so true. It is so true, which is, what are you putting out into the world, which is actually making the world behave in that way back to you? And honestly, when you're a young man in your 20s and 30s, you just don't realize it. It takes an awful lot to take on board that amount of self-reflection in order to grow up and mature. And my view is that there are very few young men who are capable of doing that in a very considered way. And that's why I always look to elite sports, and I'm always suitably impressed by the capability and quality of young leaders in them. Because you think, wow, you're the captain of, let's say, England, as Will Carling was at the age of 22, and you go, how do you do that? It's quite exceptional. So I think there's a lot that I could take away from my 20s and 30s and go, there were some very brash, uber confident moves that I made, which, on the surface looked great, but, did they really come off? Probably got away with it. But at the same time, did I really learn as much as I did from the situation that I found myself in?
And talk a little bit about, you talked obviously about you moving apart in terms of the relationship, but what about other friends as well? When you're so focused in that kind of intensity around, that high profile project that you're involved in, how do you make time for yourself in terms of relationships that are important to you?
Yeah, and well, I think that's part of the learning. Being honest, I don't think that I did in my 20s at all. I mean, and I think that was one of the reasons why that first marriage failed, is that I didn't make time for the marriage. You know, you're making time for the work, and you're focused and you're throwing yourself into that work, and that becomes all consuming, and it particularly was in the 80s and early 90s. It was a very pardon me, that was my lights coming back on in my booth. The it does become all consuming. And on one level, that's great because you're learning a lot. And if you're able to take that learning on and reflect on it and use it, then it can make a significant difference. However, if you're not, then you're just going from job, project to project, whatever it may be, and really just existing through them. So once again, my reflection on that, Andrew, is I would say I loved doing what I did. I loved doing the theatre work. I loved doing the big shows. I loved all of that it brought you. It was an ego boost. There's no question about that. And I certainly now am taking on board the lessons that were taught to me through that whole period and putting them into play in the work that I do now. But ask me if I when I was 35, if I was taking on the lessons, I'm probably going, what lessons? So I think it's the experience that creates that residual memory that you go, actually, I should think about this a bit differently.
And that takes us to the mid-30s, and obviously this transition, you mentioned it right at the start in terms of the business, being 24 years old. So talk us about the catalyst for that. You're obviously really enjoying what you were doing, involved in these great projects. You've got a great network. You probably could have carried on, doing even better and bigger things. So what was the catalyst for making a change at that point?
Well, there's two catalysts, really. I mean, it was my 30th year, and and prior to that, and this is probably quite important, though, I joined a company called Imagination, which was run by this extraordinary character called Gary Withers, still is to this day, an amazing man who became, for me personally, a bit of a mentor. He probably didn't realize it, but I think, to be fair to Gary, he was a mentor to everybody he touched. He's the most extraordinary showman I've ever come across, and he was desperate to be an impresario, and so he created Imagination Entertainments, of which I was one of I think I was employee number 2, and we were there to be at the bridge of arts and corporate. So Imagination is a huge below the line corporate communication consultancy, does all of the biggest road shows, car shows, etc., and it's still privately owned to this day. So Gary's done an amazing job on it. But the great thing about Gary is he always has an itch. He always wanted to do something more. And that's what I loved about him. The sense of, that's great, but we could do more with it. And that was something that I just learned so much from him. And also, whatever you think it looks like, it's never good enough. So I remember a wonderful moment. He won't mind me telling this, but we had two young writers at the time, George and Anthony, who are now very famous writers, who are musical writers, who'd written a show based on Tutankhamun, called Tutankhamun the Musical, and they wanted to do a showcase of it. So we decided to do it as a showcase in the foyer, which is this huge atrium at Imagination. So a couple of things around that. I mean, it's a big, vast space, and Gary was determined that it should turn it into a Tutankhamun's tomb. So we brought in over 4 tons of sand. You can imagine this, just unbelievable. Just for a showcase, we ran it on 2 nights, a Saturday and a Sunday night. And then on top of that, Imagination was extremely well known at the time and was one of the world's leading companies around projection, which was at the time, you had the big projectors, but there were very few of them. And also a lot of it was done on carousel projectors, remember the little Kodak? So we had this whole foyer set up, and he's got these glass walls down, which is the Gary's restaurant. And so we covered them all in this particular paper in order to act as a projection screen with the projectors projecting through them. So it was back projection onto these pieces of paper, which were in every single window. I always remember a wonderful gent called Chris Slingsby saying to me, who was in charge of projection. I said, I'm production managing, producing this thing. And he said, well, there's two types of paper you could have there. This one costs, I know, £1.99 per square metre. This one costs £9.99 per square metre. I said, what's the difference? He said, well, it's minimal. He said, you can sort of see. I went, okay, well, let's go for the cheaper one. He said, you better run it past Gary. And I was like, well, it's cheaper. It's saving us £2,000 or something ridiculous. He said, well, I'd run it past Gary if I was you. I ignored him. And I always remember this wonderful moment. I'd set the whole thing up, and he basically, I got this call from his secretary, Betty, at the time, saying, Jeremy, you needed downstairs. So I went downstairs, and Gary was standing there looking at this paper. And I went, hi, Gary, how you doing? And he went, what? And he was literally poking me backwards in my chest, walking down this foyer going, what have you done? Why haven't you done this? Why did you do it that way? Why didn't you ask me? It's all this kind of stuff. And I said, but you can't notice the difference. I can notice the difference. He was like, okay, first lesson. But he was brilliant. And you learn so much from people like that. And he just gives you confidence that you can do anything you want to do. So I think he was important to me. And I just, we got to a point with entertainments, it wasn't going to go as fast as personally I wanted it to go. So I decided to leave Imagination. As I was leaving, a fellow director just said to me, look, go and talk to these guys because they've got a corporate client and they need someone to help them produce a piece of corporate work, which is kind of theatrical. I really don't think they know what they're doing. So go and have a chat with them and see what it's all about. So I go along, I think it was chair of the moving picture company, who had a friend called David Pearl. And David had got this idea, had been approached by McKinsey. And the idea was that McKinsey, a wonderful guy there called Norman Sanson, had recognized that the partnership needed to think more about creativity and innovation. And you've got to remember, this is the mid-90s. So, and he wanted to do something around it. So I remember going into McKinsey on, at the time, number 1 Jermyn Street, wearing scruffy jeans and a sweatshirt. It was my first time I'd been in a proper corporate, so I was going, this is a bit odd. And they're all dressed beautifully and these wonderfully dapper women, etc. And I go into a room and there's a guy in the room who looks at me and he says, oh, we don't need the room cleaned, thank you very much. And I said, I think I'm here to meet you. And it was a guy called George Feiger, who's another extraordinary character, I remember. But basically, George and Norman, they recognized they had a challenge around creativity and innovation in their partners, and they wanted to just remind people, have a sort of an experience which was different. So we came up with this idea. So David, my then business partner, came up with this idea of putting on an opera with 400 people at a time for both McKinsey partners and their significant others, and took place in the Algarve. We took over a troupe of, so for me it was fairly straightforward. It's logistics, right? You get your trucks together, you get 50 odd people, and you build a amphitheatre in an open space in the Algarve. And we built the place, and then over 3 days we invited 400 people at a time to come and experience the amphitheatre, but say to them, in 3 days' time, you're going to be here and you're going to be performing your own opera. Dancing in it, directing, singing, doing the choreography, doing the costume, the props, etc. And they sort of look at you with disbelief, and then we send them off with various directors, choreographers, and 3 days later they come back and we've created a performance. Now, this type of immersive theatre at the time was brand new. I'd done a little bit of it up in Glasgow, but it was extraordinary to see these people and the skills and the sort of capabilities that people have when you invite them to think differently, when you invite them to explore who they could be, is amazing. So we had an amazing, a partner, and his wife was, I think, she was the lead number 1 violinist for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. So of course she was in the orchestra. She wanted to play in the orchestra. And of course then these wonderful storytellers come out who hadn't even thought about it in that context. And it was through that always remember Norman coming to us second time round and just saying, you need to set up a business, bringing the creative arts into business. So David and I said, well, okay. But he said, I quite like singing my opera. And I said, well, I quite like doing musicals. So, okay, we'll do this and maybe put it on the side and see what happens. And so we set up a company called Lively Arts. That 95 was definitely a seminal moment. So at the age of 30, I was setting up a business which was in a radical area, which there were very few other players at the time. And we were there creating immersive experiences for large corporates in a very theatrical manner, getting them to really reconnect with humanity and storytelling and play in a way that they hadn't done before. And this was the 90s, and there was a fair bit of money around to do that kind of stuff. But we did events for all sorts of amazingly large organizations around the world.
That's lovely. And that takes us into obviously what you've been doing for the last 25 years in that sense, and the enjoyment you've had out of that. It'd be useful, I think, for our audience to understand, now you provide the context, how that's changed over the last 24, 25 years in terms of how you've had to manage the growth of that, how expectations have changed, and more importantly, how you've had to change your leadership style within that. That'd be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, by the way, I never thought of myself as a leader until the last sort of 5 years of my life. So I just counter that. Has it changed? It's changed massively. I mean, that's the first thing I would say, is that, like, I would imagine, like any business that grows on the edges of what is seen as normal society, and it begins to grow, there comes a point where it becomes a little bit more mainstream. And that's when you realize all of a sudden it's going to get a lot harder. and it did. So we ran Lively Arts for 6 years. It was hugely successful. The reason we disbanded it is that David wanted to do something else and I wanted to do something else. And we decided, and we agreed, and we're very amicably, and we're still very good friends, to part. We parted, and that was when I looked to set up Just Add Water with Claire. And the work has definitely shifted. I mean, I think when we first started, it was all about the experience. It was all about creating that moment, those series of moments for the client where they would, I always remember one client saying at the end of 1,000-strong 24-hour event, he was talking to his girlfriend on the phone, and he was saying, she was asking him, so what did you do? And he said, I don't really know what we did, but it was extraordinary and I'm super excited about it. And so it was that kind of thing that was going on. Naturally, I mean, a couple of things happened. Is our industry is always impacted by geopolitical events. Anyone who says they're not is just not paying attention, in my view. So, we had the first of the millennium and the first .com crash, and that impacted people's interest in money and investing in this kind of work. We are always seen as a discretionary spend for corporates. So, anything experiential, anything around leadership, developments, culture change is seen as to a degree discretionary, which I always think is bonkers, considering how integral leadership and culture is to the success of any business performance. But we'll come on to that, I guess. But so Just Add Water began in quite a challenging circumstances, and over time we began to pick up work which was far more where we realized, and this is where the change happened for me personally, is actually we need to be at that intersection of academic thought, culture and arts, and then the third strand is business performance. And that to get getting that point at the Holy Trinity is really, really can be quite challenging. But when you get it right with an organization, you can see them accelerate. I mean, you can see the flywheel that Jim Collins talks about in Good to Great really start to flow, and know that you've been part of that change of creating sustainable growth. That's pretty special. How the work's changed, there's a lot less of the big flashy stuff, no question, over time, and everything goes in cycles, as you know, Andrew. But I would say more and more we are having to do the work in smaller settings to have a bigger dent on the individual personality, if I can say that. we still have our strong, and I always talk to our teams about the fact we have two very strong bases that we stand upon, which is play and story. And for me, they're fundamental. And I think they're fundamental not only for our work, but also in many ways, if you want to create anything new and if you want anyone to follow you. And I say that in the sense of everyone who has created anything radically different has been, at some point, been playing and has been playful in that. You just look at the great work that Steve Jobs did with Apple, and you look at the fun around that, but then look at what the difference that Johnny Ive made to it, and just, exponentially changed the direction of that company together. And that was playful. And then you look at the story they created. The story was amazing, and people follow that. So that is our base as a, both for us as a company in terms of what we're trying to sort of expend to people and engage them with, but also my contention is actually for you as an organization, you need to actually make use of these bases and think about how you put them into practice in your organization. So that's our fundamental, and we've got to a point where we've had to actually strengthen our language around that, improve our story around those two base pillars, as it were, so that to really get people understanding the value of them. So that I've noticed that is that people are wanting to actually understand the value before they even get into a particular conversation about what it might be. And more, I find that as a position where you have to be with organizations. So.
No, good. And coming to you now, you are, like me, closer towards the end of your career than the start. Let's put it that way.
Thank you.
So, so what is it that's left for you in terms of the personal dream? So put the professional to one side for a moment, and it might be linked. But from the personal dream side, what is it you're yet to do in life, do you think?
Good question. I've loved being part of running the company. I've genuinely enjoyed it. I think for me, there is unfinished business in sort of theatre and the arts. I'd love to get I should say this the other way. I would love to allow myself the opportunity to create time to actually get back and do some directing, some producing. I think there is an untold story for me in what great producers do and how the lessons that could be learnt for business. So I'm in the process of working out how I actually put that into a book of some form. And when I say I mean all producers in all walks of the creative arts, from museum creation all the way through to music producing, all the way through to actual theatre or film, whatever. Because that's an extraordinary skill set that a producer has. So I think that's important for me personally. I think I'd like to travel more. I'm very fortunate that I do get to travel a lot with my work, but I'd like to actually travel more with the work and then spend a bit more time in the place and actually enjoy it. So that's sort of probably the biggest things. I've had a great life. I mean, I'm not complaining about it at all, and I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that I've helped other people to enjoy their lives as well in what we do. I would say that at the minute, I have no plans to stop working. Retirement for me is not something that is not a word that I want to really think about. And that's not because I'm just going to work till I drop. I just genuinely think I can change the way that I do work to enjoy my life a little bit more. So that's the things for me. And just to enjoy, I've got, Claire and I really enjoy her company. So we have a great life, and I really enjoy that. And so how can we make the most of it?
And it's lovely to hear. And I truly believe, and obviously we've spoken about this in the past, but if you think about AI and its acceleration now, I don't see it as a negative. I think what it will allow people to do is what you've been trying to do for the last 24 years in that sense, is actually really focus success in business, community, organization, sustainability around the importance of relationship, of who we are in relationship with ourselves, with others, with community, with culture. So I just think the work that you do is so important and will continue to be. And, I hope it's going to be in people's minds and thoughts, the next 10, 15 years at least. So.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it is important, whether it's us doing it, whether it's somebody else doing it. It's critically important. And I find it's a very interesting time we're in at the minute. I think the journey we're on is humanity. This is this is a bit of an inflection point. We have got, there's an awful lot of challenge out there, and challenge brought by ourselves on ourselves as humans. And we really need to take the time to really consider what we're both doing to the planet, to each other, and really consider there are better ways out of this. And we need to lead ourselves out of it as well. So I think there's a lot still to do, no question in my mind. So I will keep fighting.
Great, and I really appreciate all your thoughts you've shared today. I think for me, the biggest thing is, when I see this in my work as well as you do, there are so many people out there who will probably say to themselves, I was never really any good at art at school, and I don't feel I'm good at music, or I can't sing. But actually, as you've demonstrated through your organizations you've represented over the years, we all have this ability to tap into this inner creativity as human beings. And that's the one thing I would say to people listening to this: just go out there, try something new, try to be creative. What's the worst that could happen? And Jeremy, I just want to say thank you again for coming onto the show and sharing your story with us. Oh,
it's a pleasure. I just want to echo: be playful and enjoy your life, and enjoy the story you're creating. Honestly, it's the best way to go.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Tallents into LinkedIn or your favorite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.